What's up, guys? Sean YCO here. With YCS Orlando being just about a week away, I wanted to do my prediction list for what I think will do really well at that event, including the winner, some top 8 contenders, the ones which I think will get like maybe one or two tops here and there, and the decks I think won't necessarily perform that well at this event. These decks will be judged mostly based on how well they're going to do both into the meta, that being Ryziel and Malice, as well as their overall performance when it comes to like events of this caliber. Some decks are really good for like locals and regionals, and some decks are just better for the YCS level. Up first, I'm going to have Crystron, which I think is more so in the one or two tops category. I think the deck is a strong pick in terms of a rogue strategy, but its weaknesses to really common hand traps like Molchami Fualos as well as Artifact Lancia make this deck really hard to justify being a top 8 contender. But it has the power to definitely secure one or two tops at this event. Keep in mind, this is an American YCS, so we're going to be judging these decks mostly based on how well they'll do into Fiendsmith Ryziel, which I think will be the most popular choice going into this event. Alright, to go over a deck I think won't do as well, or necessarily perform, is going to be Ritual Beast. This deck unfortunately suffers kind of the same problem as Crystron, but to a far greater extent. Lancia being in the format is really hard for this deck to deal with, so are pretty much every single Molchami, which I think each Molchami are going to see play. So this deck, even though Protos is an incredibly good tool to use, like it's shutting down your opponent's special summon of an attribute is amazing. This deck very simply loses to far too many common hand traps in order for me to really justify it as anything else but something that won't perform. Plus, it's really hard, and really hard decks don't tend to make those major tournament runs, especially at a YCS where Ritual Beast isn't as popular in America as it is in somewhere like the continent of Europe. Alright, to go over another deck, I'd say Voiceless Voice, right? Voiceless Voice, I think, is unfortunately another deck that won't perform. I personally love this deck, it's my pet deck, but it just very simply can't do that well. It suffers sort of the same fate as the other two, where it will hard lose to certain outs. Like Forbidden Droplet is a major one, and Molchami Perulia is not this deck's friend. The problem is this deck's ceiling is just too low, though. Even if it can play through certain hand traps of some hands, it just doesn't have the consistency, it doesn't have the ceiling of board that other strategies do. It just can't really compete. It's been hard power crept. It's unfortunate to say, but Voiceless has been power crept despite being released last year. On a more positive note, we have Mermail, which I think is a top 8 contender by far. This deck has many strengths. It's got so many extenders. Playing this deck through hand traps is a breeze. It just feels like each time you hit them with a Veiler or an Impam or an Ash or anything, they can just make a full board. And also, because of the hand rip, it's a rare thing in this game for an end board to include a hand rip. They mostly get banned or hit, except like Triple Tactics Talent. But this deck being able to hand rip for 2 and even 3 is absurd. Taking out your best cards to both counter them or just taking out the engine out of your hands. This deck is really good. The new support in Supreme Darkness made this deck even better as well, making them not have to run the like brick that summons a bunch of fishes. I don't remember its name, but yeah. Also, it's water, which does not lose to Bestials, and Bestials are going to be huge in this next format. They are going to be running stuff because Fiendsmith is the best engine in the game right now. So I think for sure Mermail is making it to top 8. Absolutely, it has the power to do it, and a really good pilot will for sure take it there. Another deck I think will secure one or two tops at Orlando is the White Forest Azamina deck. This deck is crazy. The new Suda support with the Azamina LZ makes this deck so much more consistent. This deck's endboards are genuinely unbreakable, pretty much for any deck in the format right now. It does take like 2 or 3 card combos to get there, which is definitely a weakness, but this deck is really strong. Like, very much so a contender you'll want to watch out for. It feels almost impossible to play against them going second. Issues, though, do remain. Like I said before, the 2 and 3 card combo issue really holds this deck back, and this deck cannot really play non-engine. Really at all. Hand traps are looking to be the dominant form of non-engine this format, and you'll need them to play against decks like Ryzeal and Malice, and this deck relying so hard on playing board breakers, especially because they synergize with the White Forests, and not having very much room for non-engine, makes this deck a lot worse, going second, which you'll be going 50% of the time. Like, you can guarantee a win going first, but you're not always going to be able to win the die roll. So I don't think this deck is going to necessarily make it to top 8 because of that weakness. For another deck I think isn't going to be performing well, I'm going to pick Labyrinth. This deck unfortunately suffers from the fact that it's a control deck, and playing control decks at high level events, especially ones with lots of rounds, each time going really down to the wire, like taking a really long time, it can be so mentally taxing. I know this because I've played lab at events before, and when you get to like round 4 or 5, that's when the fatigue starts to truly hit you, especially if you're going into time a fair bit with a deck like this. Furthermore, this deck also suffers from like a power creep syndrome. It does not have that good of a matchup into Ryzeal, unfortunately. You'd think it does with the amount of traps it does have to counter it, like Daruma Cannon and of course D-Barrier, but that all works well and good going first, but going second, it just doesn't have a game plan. Detonator really destroys this strategy, as it does with a lot of the decks on this list. Labyrinth will take a very skilled pilot, and maybe, just maybe, I could put it at the bottom of 1 or 2 tops, but I just don't think this deck's going to perform, especially at an American event where everyone's running Ryzeal Fiendsmith. It just will not have the grind game or the power to really succeed at this event. On a more positive note, I think a deck that will absolutely make it into top 8 is Tempai. Absolutely, Tempai Dragon will make it in. Its hits to both Sangan Kaiman and Chandra have basically transformed the strategy from being this uber going second, like play a bunch of hand traps and just kill with Chandra. Now it's more like essentially engine dot deck, where you fuse it with the Fiendsmith and Bestial packages to give it a much stronger game going first, while it still keeps that incredibly strong kill power that the Tempai engine provide. Basically putting your opponent on a clock of they need to make a really, really strong board, no half board, because otherwise Tempai will break it, or it will just kill you, or additionally, now putting up a going first board along with the Fiendsmith engine with cards like Wave Hiking Caesar, as well as Fiendsmith in Paradise, which gives them the extra disruptions they need to be able to stave off their opponent from killing them on turn 2. This deck is absolutely a top 8 contender going into YCS Orlando. I'm going to start to move a lot quicker with these, like more like roguish and not really gonna perform sorts of decks. So like I think that something like Medolce is just not really meta or ever really gonna be. Stuff like Synchron. When it comes to a deck like Sword Soul, I do think it might get 1 or 2 tops. Maybe like a new toy syndrome sort of thing, where because there's new support in Supreme Darkness, people are now more interested in playing it, as well as the other variants like Ryuge, Sword Soul, that sort of thing. So I think this one is like an exception to the whole like rogue is not going to do well rule. It's definitely worse than something like Crystron, but one lucky duelist will surely top with it. Another deck I think can definitely make it into top 8 contention is the Mitsurugi Ryzeal deck. I'm using the Mitsu card here as substitute, but we all know it's Mitsurugi Ryzeal. It's the best variant of the deck, and it's the only really meta-viable version of the deck. It basically does something different from what the Fiendsmith deck does, where it puts up that, ritual Omni Negate, which is really strong. Being able to negate something or force your opponent to discard a card to be able to resolve it is very good, because the game Razio likes to play is to slowly grind the opponent out before killing them, because it doesn't really have that much kill power. The ritual spell makes your opponent go -1 each turn, which basically speeds up this game plan and makes it so that the Razio player is much more favored going into the grind game. Absolutely a top 8 contender without a shred of doubt in my mind. It's a top 5 deck as well, for sure. The Ryziel and the Mitsuri cards synergize very well, especially with King of the Feral Imps and Twins of the Eclipse being able to loop its search effect. Absolutely, I think this deck is going to make it to top 8. It's even contention for the winner, but there is another deck that is going to take that spot for sure. I'm going to go a bit faster with these sorts of more irrelevant decks like Gimmick Puppet, No One Cares, Exodia, Thunder Dragon. All these decks are not going to perform. Maybe there'll be like one very lucky person with a really good bracket path that could potentially get them to have one or two tops, like decks like Ryuge. Well, Blue Eyes, I'm not gonna rank it just because the structure deck. If I was, it would be top 8 contender for sure, absolutely. But because I'm not going to, I'm just gonna leave it off the ranking. I think it's unfair to just put it with the rest of the like non-performers. Another deck that I thought was going to be a top 8 contender, but really isn't, is Yubel. Phantom of Yubel was just an exceptionally hard hit to this deck, more than I think anyone could have really predicted. This deck just doesn't do well without just being able to recycle. Sorry for the cut here. I put some more decks here that just really won't see really any play at all. Like Rescue Ace and Goblin Biker, they might get one or two tops because Goblin Biker has an uncharacteristically favorable matchup into Ryziel, which none of the other decks really do. And Rescue Ace, along with Fiendsmith, is still like somewhat in contention. It still has a chance, but the rest of these just are not really going to see any mainstream play at all. They're just not going to perform, so I just like skip through because most of them are just kind of the same explanation. Except Fiendsmith Chimera, which I put in one or two tops, but I think that the winner of the event, to no one's surprise, is going to be Fiendsmith Ryziel, represented with the Ryziel, and Malice is going to be a top 8 contender. These two crossover breakers decks have just power crept the game to the point where most strategies simply can't keep up with them. I don't think I really need to explain why the two new decks are just the best, and picking either one of them will net you great results at the tournament if you're a good enough player. Absolutely. Obviously, Malice is a bit worse because the common hand traps of like the new Molchami as well as Lance CR completely cripple the deck, but it is still by far the second strongest in the format. And Fiendsmith Ryziel, the best deck, needs no explanation. Now that we've gone over the winners, I think an interesting deck will be Centurion, and I think it will get one or two tops. This deck actually has a really good matchup into Malice because of Bestial Dispatter as well as the Branded Regained, letting them essentially profit off of the Malices being banished because they're dark monsters. It does struggle quite heavily into Ryziel, but you can mitigate that with the amount of hand traps you're playing to try and disrupt them. So I think that Centurion is actually a pretty good pick. It's going to get one or two tops for sure. I think a deck like Branded has fallen out of favor simply because Ash Blossom and Dominus Impulse are just going to be too frequent in the format for it to really do any damage to any real meta decks that don't lose that hard. I think Memento, though, is a top 8 contender. This deck is crazy. I would have played it for YCS, but complications happened, but this deck is really good. Like, most of its effects are off of the destruction of your own monsters, so Detonator's pop effect doesn't actually do that much to it. And even though it takes a really skilled pilot, it absolutely has the engine strength necessary to be able to beat the top decks. Absolutely, I think that if you don't really want to spend much on Malice and Ryziel, you should pick up Memento. Deck is crazy. It does so much, and it has so many pushes, and your opponents really won't know what hit them. People don't really know how to interrupt this deck that well. Another deck I think won't perform well is Mimigal. I'll be skipping over more of these decks. Hero, I wanted to mention as being particularly a dark horse. It could get one or two tops, but this deck just doesn't really stand up to really any of the meta decks, even with its new support. But I think it'll be popular enough for it to see some major play, and maybe top by sheer numbers. Finally, I want to talk about Pure Fiendsmith. I've just skipped all the other decks. I think it goes in the one or two top section. It's the best engine in the game, but playing it purely, it just doesn't really have that high of a ceiling. And, well, here's my list. This is my predictions for what will happen. I'll be watching the YCS to see, like, if I'm right or wrong. So let me know down in the comments what your predictions are. And with that, shine out.